All right. In this video, we're going to be talking about a way in which data visualizations come together in a very popular way these days to present information, which is a data dashboard. So data dashboards are all the rage right now. You can find them in a lot of different places. You probably have several of them on you right now. If you look in your phone, a lot of the different apps that you use are largely data dashboards that will show you things like how much you've been exercising or your calendar coming up. But they're also common on websites where a lot of articles that you might read contain data dashboards in them that allow you to explore data. And what these are really is they're a number of different visualizations or tables that come together that explore a particular data set from a number of different angles. So it's not just that you will pick one visualization to tell a story from a data set, but you might pick multiple different visualizations from usually the same data set, and you will put them together, and that will help tell a story in perhaps a more nuanced way. Often they'll also include interactivity, where you can select different things to change about which kinds of data that you're looking at. So for example, if you are looking at your exercise app on your phone, you might click one button and it would show you a graph of your walking, how much you've been walking over the past couple months. And then you would click to a different one and it might show you how much you've been eating, right? So you can interact with it and tell it which kinds of data to show you, and it can put together an overall picture of what you've been doing and what's going on in that particular data set. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the things that we're going to be going for when we're creating these dashboards. And then in the next couple of videos, we'll talk about the actual technical details of creating dashboards. So what are we trying to do with dashboard? So our idea here is really the exact same as it has been this entire course. We are trying to present a story using data, and in our analysis from the data, we want to walk our audience through that story and make sure that they come to whatever makes sense from an analytic standpoint in your data. You want to be clear and concise in terms of what that story is and how you present it, and you want it to look good too. So that's the same idea. What's really different here is a couple of things. So for one, it really ramps up how much interactivity there can be in your analysis. So this can be really nice. On one hand, it means that if we have a lot of different pieces of information that we want to show to people, we don't have to worry about how we can bring it all together. We can say, hey, if they want to look at the United States, we can show them the United States. If they want to look at Europe, they can look at Europe. If they want to look at wherever else, they can look at wherever else. We don't necessarily have to put all of it on the same graph. We can let you cycle through whatever part of it you're interested in. So there's that interactivity element. There's also the fact that we are building a story and we're trying to keep cohesive across a number of different visualizations. It's not just going to be enough to make one visualization that has an internal consistency and is easy to read. We need to do that for a lot of different visualizations. And it's not just that they individually need to be easy to read, it's that they need to come together in a way that makes a lot of sense and does not mislead us. So for example, let's say we're talking about bar graphs. Let's say we have a dashboard that's made up of a bunch of bar graphs. Now, on their own, let's say we have one bar graph where it's the percentage of people who wake up in the morning and go to work without incident, right? And maybe those numbers are like 95 and 90%. So you have those bar graphs, you got 95, you got 90%. And then over here, you have a bar graph about people who stub their toes, which doesn't happen that often. Maybe it's 1% and 2% on a given day. That would be pretty high, actually. But because the numbers are so low, right, you scale up the y-axis so that the 1% and 2% are up here and up here. Now, that would be fine on its own. You'd see the axis, okay, that's 1 or 2%. But if you put those two graphs next to each other, it's going to look like those proportions are pretty much the same because the bars are of similar sizes. So because we are going to synchronize across multiple different visualizations, we need to make sure that there's consistency in things like color coding, there's consistency in things like scale, how big a change is, and there's consistency in how we can follow a particular story. So those are the difficult parts of getting a visualization. Let's take a look at a visualization here. This is an example visualization, a year-to-date income statement produced by Tableau. So what do we got here? So we've got a number of different numbers that we might be interested in, right? Gross sales, discount, net sales, and it's showing us all this information in the same format for each variable. Now, as I mentioned, we need to have consistency across the different parts of the dashboard. That makes it easier to interpret this information in a way that makes sense, right? Here we have monthly variance to budget, and it's the exact same for every variable, meaning that once I know how this part of the dashboard works, I also know how this part of the dashboard works as well. I just am changing which variable I'm looking at. They have these cutoffs here. They have the actual number that it is. There's a little bit of fluff on here, right? This is just a number. We don't necessarily need this bar. The color of the bars may be helpful, but the size of the bar isn't really doing a lot for us. But in general, we have at least consistency across here, and we're getting a lot of information into a very small part. We also have some interactivity up here. If I want to know just about certain parts of the income, I can select or unselect certain options, and it will change what we see. And now we can see that those bars actually do make a difference, right? Once we start taking out particular regions, we can see that we're looking at segments of the income and where they go. That might be another weakness of this, right? From the initial look at the data, you can't tell what the size of those bars means. You have to wait until you start interacting with it to figure it out. So that's a possible weakness there, but we have a very good consistency. We have a lot of interactivity that we can go through. I can look at basically all the detail that I would want. If I was somebody who's really interested in the income of this particular company, everything that I need is going to be right here, and I can go into it and I can crawl around and I can see what the data says without really needing to know how to do data analysis myself. So that's a good example of a dashboard. A lot of good things about it, a couple of things that maybe could use a little bit of work. Let's talk about some general things that we want to make sure are going to be true in dashboards. So, as always, avoid clutter. We want to focus our attention on whatever it is that we want to get across. In the case of that income statement, it was just all the income, right? Where is the income coming from? You can see it in these different regions. You can see it in these different variables that we are measuring income in terms of. So avoiding clutter is really important because, especially in this context, because there's so much that we could put on there. There's a million different ways to look at data. We need to pick the visualizations that are going to be the cleanest and clearest way of getting across what we need to do without overloading people, right? It's very easy to overload the image. Let's look at some examples here, and I'm making them very tiny for a reason, right? Because I don't want you to try to look at the data that's on here. I want you to try to look at the layout and see how easy it is to parse. So here's an example of a dashboard before it sort of was decluttered and then afterwards. You can see that a number of different analyses were taken out. Things were compacted. And also some of the colors were made a little bit less intense, which makes it a little bit easier to look at. So a lot of the same information is there. In fact, we've added some more information here. You can see the longer labels on whatever this thing, and I can't even tell, but there's more labels there. And we've separated out some information to make it easier to parse. Right here we have a stacked bar graph. Those became non-stacked, which in these cases, these variables might make it easier to tell the changes of those individual components over time. We're just taking more information off of the page, making it easier to see. Using a grid is an important part of laying out your dashboard. It's very possible to make things overlap or overhang with each other, but this can make it very difficult to read. So this is the easiest way to do it anyway in most cases, is to put everything on a nice grid layout. So go ahead and do that. Don't try to mess around with it. Another thing to note here, if we look at these dashboards, we got some really big numbers, right? I've made these dashboards really tiny, but you can still see those enormous numbers. That tells me that those are very important numbers. My eye is going to go there first. If I'm trying to tell a story and I want you to know about that number, well, now I'm going to know about it, right? It's going to draw my eye. Make things, when you have multiple different visualizations, they're going to be competing for attention. You want to make sure you know which ones are most important, make those very eye-catching, draw the eye either with size, with important colors, whatever it is. We've talked about different ways of drawing the eye. And then if there's other stuff that is maybe supplementary, that can be a little bit smaller or less eye-catching. But still, even though just because we don't want to put something in just because we can like, it's not that eye-catching, it won't take up too much space, you still want to take out whatever you can to try to declutter. In terms of fonts and colors, as I mentioned, big and bold for upfront conclusions, right? You want to think, what are the key points of interest that I want people to take away from this dashboard, and make sure that those things are very easy to see. We want consistency across the visualizations. If you use color, you want to make sure that the coloring is consistent across the different graphs. Sometimes this means something like, okay, all of my Asian income is green, and all of my European income is blue, and so I want to make sure that in every different graph, Asia is green and Europe is blue, right? It could also just be that the colors don't necessarily signify groups in that same way, right? They're not an aesthetic, but you would still want to just have a consistent color style so that it's a little bit more pleasing to the eye. That also means that if you wanted something to really pop out, you could break out of that color style a little bit and put something really flashy in that would draw the eye. You want to really limit the number of fonts as well. Keep the fonts consistent, maybe 1 or 2 fonts at most. Really big fonts for really big conclusions, and then smaller fonts for things that you need a little bit more detail on. Here we can see some examples of the kinds of fonts that are being used. So again, only 1 or 2 fonts. And again, the ones that we can see are really, really big. Those are the things that are really going to draw our eye. Those are the numbers that we need to know about. You can see consistent coloring across the entire dashboard. In the case of the 2 ones on the right, we have gray and blue. Those are very common for dashboards. They just sort of feel futuristic or modern, I guess. Over here on the left, we have black and yellow. And that one, really all the data appears to just be yellow. So that's a unicolored dashboard, which is very clean. Again, you don't feel bad about having more than 1 color or even more than 2, but you do want to keep it as small as possible, and you want it to be consistent. That's really important. All right, so we've talked about some of the basics of putting dashboards together, the kinds of things we want to see when we start putting those dashboards together. And in the next couple of videos, we can talk about how we actually do that. Thank you.